there a band out there that everyone talks about that maybe secretly you've never actually listened to? Maybe you don't know where to start. Maybe you're too embarrassed to ask. Don't worry, I'm here to help. Time for the first video in a new series I'm calling Starter Packs. I'm giving you 2 to 3 projects or albums to start with if you're just getting into a band or artist. So this first edition, I just mainly went with stuff that I'm very familiar with. Some of these are going to be no-brainers, but there might be some hot takes in here too. I'm curious about your opinions, and if you're a diehard fan of one of these bands, what your starter pack would look like. So let me know in the comments below. All right, here we go. First up, Green Day. Maybe you're a newcomer to punk music or pop punk, or you're younger and you've fallen in love with all the newer bands in the scene and you want to dive into the older stuff. Or maybe you're older and you just completely missed the Green Day train. Whatever the case, Green Day is an easy band to get into, even if you're not really into quote-unquote punk music. They owe their success to the foundations of being able to write catchy as hell power pop. I'm a lifelong fan of this band, and while I have my preferences, the answer to where you start with Green Day, it's no mystery. Nothing controversial here. It's cliche because it's true. Dive into Dookie. Not literally. I'm talking about the album, their major label debut from 1994. It's a landmark of its time and genre, and it inspired countless bands. Green Day were basically kids when they put this out, and it took off and made them stars overnight. It went diamond here in the US. You're gonna know a lot of songs off of this one if you're new to Green Day, like Basket Case or When I Come Around, but there's plenty of deep cuts that will intro you to the band's bratty energy and penchant for hooks. The other big moment in Green Day's career arguably is their big comeback album, American Idiot, which was so big it spawned its own Broadway musical. The boys have grown up, they're big rock stars, the production is brighter, the hooks are bigger. This album was the kickoff of what we probably would call later era Green Day. The band has changed a lot, but the fundamentals and the huge punk sound are still intact. You'll know some trademark signature songs here too. Don't sleep on the lesser known cuts, and try to follow along with the storyline of American Idiot. This is, after all, a quote-unquote punk rock opera. And in my opinion, that's part of the fun. Okay, next up on the list we have Tyler, the Creator. In just a decade, Tyler has gone from a shock rapper to a Grammy-winning, subversive, genre-bending trendsetter in hip-hop. His early stuff comes with its fair share of controversy, while his newer projects have been more or less universally acclaimed. Tyler's evolution as an artist is fascinating, but if you're just starting off with him, I would lean into the best stuff first and then move backward. I'm probably going to get a lot of heats in the comments for this one, but honestly, the early stuff, Bastard, Goblin, I would just skip it. Just watch the instant classic video for Yonkers if you want to get a sense of this period in Tyler's career, and merely for the sake of cultural significance. This was a huge video when it came out. Tyler's output in the early days, in my opinion, isn't his best, and his misogyny and homophobic lyrics, they weren't that awesome to start with, and they've aged only more poorly since their release. Also, don't start with Cherry Bomb. It's a bit of a mess in terms of production, and it's generally regarded as his least appealing album. If you want a sense of early Tyler, the Creator, I would start with Wolf. This album still has that cocky and controversial Tyler persona, but Wolf dove even deeper into his personal demons and started incorporating some trademark Tyler sonics and production choices. For a beginner, it's just easier to digest. From there, listen to Flower Boy. In my opinion, it's his best album, and it's pretty much a 180 from everything he had done prior. It's more serious, mature, personal, genuine. The rapping here is minimal to give the instrumentation more focus, which is a good thing. It's almost like hearing a completely different artist. And if you like Flower Boy, I would go for the superb follow-up, Igor, which came out in 2019. And then I would work backward and fill in the blanks. Next up, the Beatles. So if you're a hardcore music fan, you're probably like, who needs an intro course to the Beatles? They're one of the biggest and best bands of all time. Well, a lot of people actually. Some people don't have parents that have the White Album in their collection, or they've only really heard the big hits on the radio. And plus the Fab Four put out a ton of great music in a short amount of time, which can be overwhelming. So of course I recommend you go deep into the Beatles and listen to as much as you can. Everything is different and exciting and seminal, but I've narrowed it down here to just 3 starting points. Okay, first off, for the early days and the height of Beatlemania, when they were leading the sound of the British invasion, they were on Ed Sullivan, that whole era, make sure you watch the movie for and listen to the album for A Hard Day's Night. While it's not my personal favorite from this period, this is arguably their best album from the Mop Top era, with a ton of great original songs, and the film really showcases the humor of the boys and just what a sensation they were at the time. Now, as the 60s progressed and the Beatles got tired of being in the Beatles, they started doing drugs and experimenting more, and they all started bringing their own interests to the table. And the first and maybe best example of this is the 1966 album Revolver. You can hear every member's creative output. We're talking about Paul's foray into traditional and orchestral arrangements, John's preference for loud guitar, basically hard rock before it was hard rock, and then George, this was the beginning of his lifelong passion for the sitar and Indian music. When you get to the tail end of the Beatles' career, I would go with their final album. Well, technically their final album. It was the one they recorded last. I'm talking about Abbey Road. Everyone here is in peak songwriting form, especially the underutilized George Harrison. He wrote the album's best 2 songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Once you listen to those 3, depending on what era you liked best, I would listen to the output around that, or just start at the beginning and fill in the blanks. The Beatles' whole body of work has a range in quality from enjoyable to downright perfect and awesome, so you can't really go wrong here. The next one's gonna be fun. Kanye West.
Let's get lost tonight. You could be my black Kate Moss tonight. Play secretary.
Setting aside the public spectacle that has been Kanye for the entirety of his time in the spotlight, a narrative that's gone from humorous and entertaining to head-scratching to, most recently, very troubling. There's no doubt this man is a brilliant and trend-setting force in hip-hop music. Another amazing artist with a varied, huge body of work, and not all of it is immediately accessible for the uninitiated. So where do you start? I think for Kanye, it's easier to talk about where not to start, like 808s and Heartbreak and Yeezus. These are 2 of my personal favorites, but for someone just getting into Kanye, they're too experimental, they're too noisy, and they're too much of outliers in his catalog to begin with. I also wouldn't start with the recent stuff like Yay and Jesus is King, just because it's not his best stuff. Audiences are probably most familiar with the albums from the Bear era. That's Kanye's first 3 albums. They contain the stuff he's most well known for by the masses, the soul samples, the big pop and electronic samples, the big hits. College Dropout is a great debut album, but I would go with the more polished and legacy establishing Late Registration for your first dose. The highs are really high here. My personal favorite from this era is Graduation. Just had to throw that in. From there, I would jump to the album that re-established Kanye as an undeniable figure in popular music, and that's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. It's his version of what could be considered a near-perfect album. Critics and audiences loved it upon its release. It was universally acclaimed, and it not only showcases his lyrical wit and his great production, but also his ability for curation and collaboration. The showstopper here isn't really even Kanye, but Nicki Minaj in her verse on Monster, which was a career-defining moment for her. Okay, from there, I would jump back into College Dropout, Graduation, dive into 808s, to hear Kanye way ahead of his time. He pretty much predicted what hip-hop was going to sound like for the next decade. Turn it up loud for the cacophony that is Yeezus, and treat yourself to Kanye's best project of the past few years, The Life of Pablo. Everything else, probably just for the diehard fans and completists. And finally, Radiohead. This band has such an opinionated and passionate fan base, especially online, and for good reason. Radiohead are one of the most influential, excellent, and exciting bands of the past 20 years. So naturally, when we're talking about what the best moments in the band's history are, there's going to be some great discussion and a lot of opinion. But what about recommendations for a person who's never listened to a note of this band? In my opinion, things are cliche for a reason, because they're mostly accepted and true. And for a band like Radiohead, if you want someone to get into them, give that person what is generally regarded as the very best. Start with the band's greatest album, OK Computer. An album that stood out from its grungy counterparts in the 90s. It basically birthed a whole wave of beautifully crafted, introspective, British-based rock music. Start to finish, this album is the band's singular moment. The one where everyone's heads turned and their ears perked up if they weren't listening already. And after that, go to the one that was immediately after OK Computer, Kid A. One thing Radiohead is well known for after establishing themselves as smart, sophisticated, guitar-based band is they dumped all that and became a smart, sophisticated, experimental electronic band. That's Kid A. If you like what you hear on their first two albums, you're likely going to be a fan of Radiohead, or at least pretty eager to hear what else they conjured up. So from there, I would skip ahead to a later period album that showcased the band's still dominant talents for making beautiful, intelligent indie rock, In Rainbows. It's the most consistent and immediately accessible of their 21st century albums, and it's a good album for people who aren't really familiar with the band. From there, I would keep diving into their best stuff. A Moon-Shaped Pool, Hail to the Thief, Amnesiac, The Bends. Save Pablo Honey and The King of Limbs for last. The former is unremarkable, and the latter is pretty challenging. Okay, that wraps up the first edition of Starter Pack. What do you think of my picks? What would your starter packs look like for these bands? Also, I'm taking submissions all the time for the next round of starter packs. So if there's a band or artist you want to see a starter pack for in the future, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel and keeps me in good standing with my new BFF, the almighty YouTube algorithm. My name's Ben, the Playlist Fiend. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.